Hey guys, tonight we're settling into the soft, slightly dusty folds of history to trace a most peculiar path, not of an emperor, but of his hat. Imagine cannon fire in the distance, drums echoing through the hills, smoke curling in the air, and then, through the blur, you see it. A wide black hat, worn sideways, unmistakable, even from 100 yards away. It's moving fast, too fast for someone who should be ruling the world. That, dear listener, is Napoleon Bonaparte, and yes, his hat is leading the charge. You probably won't survive this, not because of battlefield peril, mind you, but because tonight's journey through sartorial legacy is likely to lull you into a deep, surprisingly educational slumber. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always a joy to see who's falling asleep to French military fashion from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1805, and you are somewhere just outside of Ulm in southern Germany. It's dawn. The air is heavy with the promise of bad decisions and damp wool. Soldiers are waking, their boots stiff from yesterday's march. And then, without trumpet or trumpety flourish, the general arrives. Or rather, his hat does. It's shaped like a crescent moon and worn sideways, not front to back like a normal human would do. This, you will later learn, is on purpose. Napoleon wants to be recognized at a distance. He wants silhouettes, not just speeches, to do his talking. And that flat-brimmed, wide, stiff-edged bicorne does the job. This hat, black felt, usually edged in silk, plain, unadorned, cuts a simple but arresting figure against the blue-gray mist. No feather, no plume, nothing flamboyant, just shape and shadow and purpose. You could spot it from across a river or through a crowd of officers who all look like someone's powdered uncle. And that's the first secret of Napoleon's hat. It was never meant to be just a hat. It was iconography, a walking emblem, a signal. When you saw it coming, you knew something important was about to be said, signed, or invaded. It rests atop a fairly short, often damp, occasionally irritable Corsican head. Below that, a gray greatcoat, wool trousers, boots that have seen better mud, but it's the hat that does the heavy lifting in terms of presence. The rest is just scaffolding. Historians still argue whether Napoleon chose the bicorne because it made him look taller or because it was simply practical for the battlefield. Some say it was a stylistic rebellion rejecting the towering, plumed monstrosities worn by royal officers of the time. Others suggest he just liked things tidy and horizontal. After all, Napoleon was nothing if not methodical. His handwriting may have looked like a chicken's last confession, but his fashion choices were crisped. And while the hat looks rather basic to us now, it was a quiet revolution in uniformity. Officers in Napoleon's army were allowed to express themselves within reason, but the man himself set a strict example. No fluff, no gold braid, just a steady figure in gray, topped with a hat that never, ever blinked. You walk now along a muddy path behind the army's vanguard. Soldiers in shako caps, those tall, stovepipe-looking things, march with heavy packs and heavier yawns. A few glance toward the ridge where Napoleon stands, consulting a map with a stubby pencil and gesturing toward hills as if rearranging furniture. The hat never moves. It just hovers, a black parenthesis in a beige and green paragraph. Nearby, A younger officer tries adjusting his own hat to match the general's. It flops. His comrades laugh. And somewhere inside that laughter is a growing awareness the hat means something. You pause for a moment, rubbing your feet, feeling the early morning chill creep through your cloak. Around you, the army is waking. Horses snort, drummers stretch. A cook stirs something unspeakable in a copper pot. And yet, the most compelling figure on the field is a man no taller than you. Wrapped in wool and thought, with a hat that has already started whispering its way into history. Nah. That hat will outlive the cannon fire, the marching boots, the muddy tents. It will outlive this war, and the next, and the next. And not just because of who wore it, but because of how he wore it. There's a moment as the sun rises fully, when the light catches the brim just right. It flashes briefly, gold on black, and you understand the hat isn't just Napoleon's signature, it is Napoleon, reduced to silhouette, to gesture, to a slant on the horizon. Later, this same hat will appear in paintings, cartoons, opera posters, and even on sugar tins. But for now, it is simply a crown turned sideways, worn by a man who prefers momentum over medals. You walk a bit farther, watching the army prepare. You hear a colonel shout, a horse rears, a group of soldiers march double time past you, eyes fixed straight ahead, but you're still watching the hat, still following that crescent like a moon that refuses to set. And somewhere in the back of your mind, lulled by the rhythm of boots and breeze, you realize this story is going to be less about Napoleon and more about the object he made unforgettable. The hat that became a celebrity. You keep walking, boots sinking slightly in the soft earth as the fields of Europe roll gently away on either side. The air is crisp now. Clean in that way it can only be after thousands of men have stomped through and moved on, leaving behind an oddly peaceful silence. The hat, yes, the hat is gone from view for the moment, but it lingers in your mind like an afterimage. Which is fitting, because tonight you're going to learn how that odd little shape atop Napoleon's head was crafted with more thought than most people put into their life goals. Let's talk design. The bicorne two-cornered, curved like a crescent moon wasn't a fashion accident. It evolved from the tricorne, the triangular hat you see in paintings of powdered men signing things with feathers. The tricorne was more social, more let me look fancy in a salon while discussing poetry. The bicorne, on the other hand, was its serious cousin, flattened, streamlined, made for war, not for tea. Napoleon wore it en bataille, that is, with the points to the sides, rather than front to back. This was not the default setting. Most officers wore their bicornes lengthwise, like a canoe parked atop their heads. But Napoleon turned his sideways, and suddenly, it wasn't just a hat, it was a silhouette. It framed his face like parentheses, emphasizing his sharp profile. From afar, it gave him a distinct outline, instantly recognizable to allies and enemies alike. You pass a quiet grove now. The trees are bare, the branches curled like old hands. A courier rides past on a chestnut horse, hat flapping slightly in the breeze, one of the many officers who tried to imitate the general's look and ended up with something closer to tired pastry chef. Napoleon's hat was simple, but intentionally so. No plumes, no frills, no embroidery. The material felt black, stiffened with shellac, shaped carefully over wooden molds. It was functional, durable, easily recognizable against a foggy skyline. And because he had so many made, it had to be replicable. There's a quiet efficiency to that. He didn't want one perfect hat. He wanted 10 identical ones, so he could grab whichever wasn't covered in campaign soup and keep moving. Inside, that each hat was lined with silk and reinforced to hold its form. A narrow band would sometimes absorb sweat. Some say Napoleon preferred a slightly tight fit. He believed it made him more alert. Others say he just didn't like fiddling with straps during strategy sessions. Historians still argue whether Napoleon had a preferred milliner or if multiple hat makers contributed to his legendary look. Some suggest he sourced them from Poupart, a Parisian artisan known for military headwear. Others think his valet had a hand in choosing the best among various suppliers. Whoever made them, they did so with precision because anything less than uniformity would have been rejected. You walk past a small stream now, frozen at the edges. A pair of soldiers kneel beside it, filling canteens and complaining about the cold. One of them wears a hat similar to Napoleon's but wider, slightly misshapen, and floppier at the corners. He shrugs, tries to adjust it, and finally gives up. It's the thought that counts. That's the thing, once Napoleon's look became iconic, everyone wanted a piece of it. Officers, artists, even children's toys began to mimic the style, but few could replicate the understated perfection. His hats were clean, symmetrical, and somehow managed to look authoritative even when mud-spattered and tilted. You keep walking, the wind tugging gently at your cloak. Up ahead, a group of horses waits near a crossroads. A junior officer holds a map while his companion adjusts his headgear in a bronze shaving mirror. He tilts it sideways just a bit, trying to catch the angle. It's close. Almost there. But it lacks the confidence. That's what really made Napoleon's hat work, not the shape, but the posture beneath it. One little known tidbit, Napoleon never wore his hat indoors. He wasn't that kind of man. He understood the power of symbols, and he reserved them for moments that needed impact. You didn't see him hunched over breakfast in a tent, hat perched like a mushroom. No, he put it on with intent. The hat went on. The world took notice. You walk through another bend in the road, dust rising beneath your steps. The day is fading now, the sun sinking behind low hills. It paints the land in amber, turning everything soft at the edges. You imagine Napoleon walking the same path, hands behind his back, hat casting a shadow that seemed larger than the man himself, but that shape black, simple, slanted would soon appear in paintings, medals, and even enemy propaganda. It was iconic before we even had the word iconic. A brand without a logo. A shape burned into history through repetition and posture. You pass a half-buried signpost. Its lettering faded by wind and years. But someone, long ago, carved a small crescent at its base. You smile. The hat lives on even here, among the forgotten roots of old campaigns. And tomorrow, when a clerk sketches a scene from today's march, he'll draw a dozen soldiers, a few horses, and one small figure on a hill with a hat that no one will mistake. The design worked, and it still does. The twilight settles in slowly, like an old friend easing into a well-worn chair. You're still walking. Of course, because that's what we do here, but your pace is softened. The wind curls lazily around your shoulder, and the road narrows as it slips between two low ridges. You're not just following Napoleon anymore. You're following the shape he left behind. And now it's time to visit the quieter side of things, court life, ceremonies, rooms filled with silk and politics, because the hat didn't just march into battle. It also strolled through palace corridors and gave perfectly calculated nods at state dinners. Yes, the battlefield made it famous, but court life gave it context. Napoleon wore his hat like a weapon, even at the dinner table. While most men of power leaned into powdered wigs and polished shoes, Napoleon kept it stark, his clothes functional, almost severe, his hair short, His hat plain, while others sparkled, he radiated focus. You arrive now at an imaginary evening reception at the Tuileries Palace. Tall windows flicker with candlelight. Laughter hums like a stringed instrument beneath the surface of polite conversation. Crystal glasses clink, fans flutter. And into this glowing hush walks Napoleon with that sideways bicorne perched like punctuation on his silhouette. He doesn't need an introduction. He doesn't need an entourage. The hat enters first. People see it, and they quiet. Even those who loathed him had to admire the audacity of a man at the height of imperial power, wearing the same unadorned hat he'd worn on the battlefield. You pause in the hall, beside a long table laden with silver trays and delicate pastries shaped like swans. Off to the side, an Austrian diplomat raises an eyebrow. "Still with that hat," he whispers. "Does he ever change?" The French minister beside him just shrugs. "It's the only hat anyone remembers." That was the point. Napoleon's fashion wasn't about self-expression. It was about control. Where monarchs relied on jeweled crowns and ermine capes, he preferred something humbler and more unnerving. The bicorne was like a signature you could see from across the room. You didn't need a caption. Historians still argue whether his stark look was political or personal. Was he deliberately rejecting the ornate trappings of the monarchy, or did he simply find comfort in consistency? There's even debate over whether he resisted elaborate uniforms because he didn't want to be mistaken for his own generals. He needed to stand apart, but without shouting. You walk into a side salon now. The wallpaper is green damask. The floor creaks gently beneath your steps. A trio of artists studies Napoleon from across the room, sketching him mid-conversation. They don't focus on his hands or the medals on his chest. They focus on the hat. One draws it too large. One forgets the slight tilt. The third gets it just right flat, low, slanted to the left, brim curling slightly at the ears. The iconic profile. There's a rumor that during official portrait sittings, Napoleon would insist on adjusting the hat himself. One valet claimed he once stopped a painting session for 10 minutes, demanding the artist flatten the brim. It should not rise like a fool's cap. Whether that's true or not, it fits. The hat wasn't just clothing, it was a tool. And like all good tools, it came with rules. Napoleon never tilted it backward, never added plumes, never wore it cocked at an angle like some rakish cavalier. No flourish, just clean, military geometry. The kind of geometry that made generals nervous and ambassadors reassess their opening lines. Even his posture worked with the hat, hands tucked behind his back, chin slightly down. This forced observers to notice the shape first, then the man. The hat was like a visual drum roll. Prepare yourself. Authority approaches. You leave the salon, stepping back into a quiet corridor where the candlelight flickers against polished stone. A servant passes, carrying a folded greatcoat with a bicorne carefully balanced on top. You glance at it, it's just felt and thread. Simple. Silent. And yet, it has more presence than most of the nobility assembled tonight. That's the trick, really. While kings dressed to dazzle, Napoleon dressed to dominate space. His hat cut across silk like a blade. It refused decoration, and in doing so, drew the eye more than any jewel ever could. There's a particularly quiet moment now, your footsteps muffled on thick rugs. You approach a balcony and look out at the Seine. Winding below in the moonlight, Paris sleeps, mostly. But somewhere, probably behind a curtain or atop a polished cabinet, that same hat rests, waiting for tomorrow, waiting for another moment to say everything without saying a word. You step back inside, where the music has returned, and voices rise in soft waves. The emperor is no longer in the room. But his absence changes nothing. People still talk in hushed tones, still glance toward the doorway every few minutes, just in case the hat comes back. It always does. The night air cools your skin as you step back out onto the quiet road, the sound of the palace far behind you now. The stars above are faint pinpricks behind a veil of clouds, and the path ahead feels older somehow, worn by centuries and softened by memory. You walk with your hands tucked behind your back, posture echoing a certain imperial figure. And even though it's only in your mind, you can almost feel the weight of a hat resting gently across your brow, its brim reaching out like a compass needle. It's time to return to the field, not the palace or the painted salons, but to the grit and rattle of campaign life. Because while the hat was a courtly statement, it was also a battlefield companion. And as odd as it may sound, it sometimes had a bad habit of getting left behind. You trudge now through the vague terrain of Central Europe, boots kicking up dust as you go. It's the spring of 1809. The army is moving again. The tents are coming down, the maps are being folded with more confidence than they probably deserve, and somewhere nearby, Napoleon is preparing to address his staff. But wait, his hat is missing. Yes, really. It turns out that even the most iconic fashion symbols are still subject to the classic human tendency to misplace things. Several accounts exist of Napoleon temporarily losing his hat. One incident occurred during the Battle of Wagram, when in the flurry of reviewing troops and barking orders, the emperor tossed his bicorne onto a nearby camp stool and promptly forgot it. A quartermaster, realizing the gravity of the situation, reportedly spent 20 frantic minutes locating the forgotten headpiece. When he returned, panting and red-faced, Napoleon simply nodded, placed the hat back on his head, and resumed his orders without a word. Historians still argue whether these incidents were dramatic retellings or genuine episodes of forgetfulness. Some suggest they were exaggerated to humanize the man. Others believe Napoleon was fully aware of the panic he caused and may have found it amusing. After all, if your hat is famous enough to cause a minor crisis when it vanishes, you've made your mark. You pass a small encampment now, just a few flickering lanterns, the scent of iron and wood smoke hanging low. A group of young officers sit around a map spread on a crate. One of them, clearly new, fumbles with his bicorne, unsure whether to wear it front to back or side to side. The others smirk. Sideways. You dolt. Don't you want the old man to think you know what you're doing? Because by now, the sideways bicorne wasn't just a hat. It was a badge of seriousness, of proximity to the emperor's circle. The angle said, "I've seen things." It also said, "I really don't want to get yelled at before coffee." Napoleon himself reportedly traveled with several hats. Most agree the number hovered around 12 at any given time. They were packed carefully in separate boxes, often with handwritten notes to indicate recent use. Each hat was almost identical, yet they acquired their own tiny legends. One became famous for being worn during the crossing of the Alps. Another was supposedly on his head when he dictated a treaty while suffering from a head cold. And one, now in a museum, still bears faint traces of blood and rain from the Battle of Eylau. You pass a forgotten carriage now, half covered in ivy. In its day, it might have carried Napoleon's personal effects hats included across the ravaged roads of Europe. Inside, you imagine the faint scent of leather and dust, the small brass latch of a hat box clicking open with ceremonial gravity. And this brings you to a quiet truth. Napoleon's hats were not merely clothing or convenience. They were instruments, as much a part of his command style as his piercing stare or his clipped tone. He could point with the brim. He could bow slightly and let the shadow fall just right. He could remove it very deliberately in the presence of a soldier receiving a medal and suddenly elevate that moment to the realm of sacred memory. One of the more touching anecdotes tells of Napoleon removing his hat before a wounded drummer boy who had stayed behind to sound the alarm. He knelt, placed the hat on the boy's lap, and whispered something no one else heard. The boy died shortly after, but the hat was returned to the imperial tent and never worn again. Real or myth, hard to say, but the image stays with you. You reach a clearing now, lit only by the low moon. In the center is a wooden post with a French eagle carved into the top, weathered and cracked. Beneath it, nestled carefully in a wooden frame, rests a faded replica of Napoleon's bicorne. It's probably not real, just a tribute, but still, it catches the light like the originals. And here's the thing, nobody ever leaves a replica of Napoleon's shoes, or his gloves, or even his sword. But the hat gets alters. You sit on a nearby stump, the quiet pressing in comfortably. You picture the emperor rising before dawn, stepping out of his tent into the cold air, looking over his army, and placing the hat on his head like a general donning his thoughts. There's something deeply soothing about the idea that even in the chaos of empire, there was a ritual, a shape, a presence, something steady on the head of someone who had to be everything at once: visionary, tyrant, administrator, dreamer. And the hat, unlike the man, never cracked. The sky turns lavender now, streaked with the last hints of dusk, and the road becomes quieter than ever. You walk without thinking, lulled by the rhythm of your own steps and the knowledge that, up ahead, somewhere in the folds of history, another hat is waiting. Because if you thought there was just one Napoleon hat, just one iconic piece of felt that bore the brunt of war and fame, you'd be adorably mistaken. Tonight, we're opening his travel trunks. Not literally. Of course, you forgot your tiny museum gloves, but with the sleepy curiosity of someone paging through a closet from 2 centuries ago, because inside those trunks, identical hats, lots of them. Napoleon owned somewhere between 120 and 160 bicorne hats over the course of his career. He wore them nearly every day from the late 1790s through his exile and eventual death in 1821. And they were made to a strict template-wide brim. No plume, satin lining, the small cockade on the left side turned sideways like a ruler underlining a map. The surprising part, they were nearly indistinguishable from each other. If you lined up 12 of them on a table, you'd think you were being pranked. They look like clones, but each one had its own quiet history. One saw him through Austerlitz, one was on his head at the coronation. One traveled to Moscow. Another returned from Russia without him. You reach a resting stone now, carved with initials in curling 19th century script. You sit, brush away the dust, and imagine the emperor's valet Constant kneeling beside a trunk, carefully lifting out one of these hats and inspecting the lining for wear. He'd choose the best one for the day. If the brim was too warped, it went back. If the silk was frayed, it went in the discard pile. Napoleon expected uniformity not just in his troops, but in his image. Each hat was slightly reinforced to hold its shape. The shellac kept it stiff. The brim had to hold a perfect curve. If it began to droop on one side, heaven forbid it would either be repaired or quietly retired. Rumor has it that Napoleon once handed a misshapen hat to a marshal and said, "It's yours now, it's thinking of surrendering." Historians still argue whether Napoleon truly rotated his hats on a daily basis, or whether he had favorites. Some believe he wore a single hat for long stretches, others suggest he cycled them like socks. The truth is, he probably did both. But what's clear is that he never deviated from the style. The consistency was the point. You walk again, passing a ridge where crows flutter overhead. In the distance, a hilltop silhouette catches your eye, a small wooden cross, weathered gray. Below it, a plaque, in memory of the hat worn at Ligny. Of course, it's a replica, but the plaque makes no mention of battles or bloodshed. It simply notes the hat. There's something oddly comforting about that. You imagine Napoleon setting out on campaign, his baggage train packed tightly, tents, medical supplies, cannons, and tucked in among the gunpowder and correspondence, a velvet-lined trunk filled with identical hats, labeled, catalogued, ready. His staff would have known the drill. The valet preps the tent, the aide-de-camp lays out the maps, and the hat, it's positioned on the campaign table with almost spiritual reverence. One soldier once wrote in a letter, "When the general is absent, his hat alone makes the air feel tenser. I saw it resting on a chair, and men saluted as they passed." That may sound ridiculous, but in an army where uniforms were enforced with obsessive precision, the hat was more than apparel. It was presence. Even when Napoleon wasn't in the room, the hat could command silence. There's an oft-retold tale, probably embellished, of a moment during the Egyptian campaign. Napoleon was ill and unable to address the troops. His officers, thinking quickly, placed one of his hats on a tall stool, facing the ranks. When the men saw it, they stood straighter, marched cleaner. They saluted the stool. Real maybe, effective absolutely. The hat had become a totem, not just of leadership, but of stability. It never shouted. It didn't flinch. It didn't change with mood or weather. It was always there. That flat black arc on the horizon, reminding people that someone had a plan, even if that plan involved crossing mountains on foot in winter. And then there were the oddities. One of Napoleon's hats was reportedly damaged during a storm in Spain, blown from his head, trampled by a horse, and retrieved by a soldier who stuffed it under his tunic. Instead of discarding it, Napoleon had it patched and continued wearing it through the campaign. It became known as Le Chapeau Fatigué, the tired hat. It said he wore it at his tent desk while writing letters late at night, as if the battered brim matched his own frayed thoughts. Another hat preserved in a Belgian museum has a barely visible ink stain on the lining, said to be from a spilled inkwell during the signing of a ceasefire. The stain remains, a little smudge of history, hidden beneath silk. You pass a tree now, under which someone has placed a replica bicorne. The tag beneath it reads, "In honor of the spare hats, the quiet ones." You smile, because, yes, even the backups matter. And maybe that's the lesson. Not everything loud is legendary. Sometimes it's the quiet, consistent things, the backups, the duplicates, the pieces that simply show up every day that end up etched in gold leaf and museum glass. So, you walk on, the wind now tugging softly at your coat. The moon is high, and somewhere in the mist ahead, another hat waits identical, but never the same. You're deeper into the night now, your path lit by the soft glow of moonlight slipping between skeletal branches. The road is leveled out again, and with it comes a hush so complete, you begin to hear the rhythm of your breath matching your steps. You pass a few stones that look suspiciously like someone tried to stack them into a chair, but you don't sit, not yet, because you're following the shape again, the curve, the brim, the steady presence of Napoleon's hat, even in snow. Yes, tonight it's winter. Frost clings to the edges of your sleeves. Your boots crunch against patches of frozen mud, and somewhere in the cold mist ahead, A solitary figure moves across the white expanse with purpose. The hat is unmistakable sideways, stiff, catching flakes like a crescent made of shadow. This is the Napoleon you don't always see in portraits. No glowing gold robe, no throne, no coronation laurel. Just a man in a greatcoat, tramping through Russia or Prussia or wherever poor decisions and frostbite tend to meet. His troops are cold, he is colder, and yet the hat remains unchanged. Same shape, same black felt, same tilted determination. The silhouette becomes everything in this landscape. Historians still argue whether the image of Napoleon in the snow is more myth than memory. Most of the famous paintings were created decades later, filtered through romanticism and national pride. But soldiers who survived the Russian campaign spoke of the unmistakable figure on horseback, wrapped in wool, hat covered in frost, speaking very little, and seeing everything. You walk beside him now, the crunch of hooves, the creak of saddle leather, the quiet murmur of aides beside him. No one talks too much. The air is thin, the mood thinner, and yet the hat leads. It's what the men look for, cutting through fog, through despair, a black triangle on the white canvas of the world. There's something oddly comforting in that. Napoleon's hat became a beacon, especially in conditions where faces blurred and uniforms vanished under cloaks. The sideways silhouette gave him instant recognition, like a flag without fabric. If the hat was upright and moving, the emperor was still planning, still pushing forward, still fighting, even if only on paper. One soldier riding home from the retreat in 1812 described how morale would lift just a bit. Whenever they saw that line of black against the snow, he didn't say Napoleon. He said that line, the hat, had become the man. You reach a frozen stream now, its surface cracked and silver. A small wooden bridge stretches across it, sagging under age and snow. In the center, a carved plank bears the faint image of a bicorne. Someone remembered, and someone always does. You press on through the cold, imagining the endless campaigns. Eylau, Wagram, Smolensk, men fighting, retreating, rebuilding, always the same hat, always the same downward tilt, the brim shadowing the eyes. It gave nothing away. Which was, of course, intentional. Napoleon rarely wore emotion on his sleeve, but he never wore it on his head. The hat was a mask of sorts, not a deception, but a filter. It allowed him to observe, to command, to move like a symbol rather than a man. He could be exhausted, furious, cold to the bone, but the hat never changed. And so, to the soldiers, neither did he. There's a quiet power in that kind of constancy, and like a lighthouse during a storm, doesn't tell you everything's fine, it just tells you where to look. You pass a withered oak now, its branches twisted against the wind. At the base is a small bundle of cloth, maybe left by a traveler, maybe just a forgotten scarf. But beside it, almost reverently placed, is a felt hat. Cheap, probably modern, but it's angled sideways. Someone remembered the angle. One story, half real and half romantic, tells of Napoleon riding alone ahead of his troops during a blizzard. He stopped at a small farmhouse, stepped inside, and took off his hat. The peasant inside had never seen the emperor in person, but when he saw the hat, he fell to his knees. The hat entered before the man. He reportedly said, "You smile at that? Because yes, it did." Even in exile, first on Elba, then on St. Helena, the hat came with him. It was less crisp by then, a little tired. The brims didn't hold as firm, but it was still there, still him. And as his world shrank from empire to island, that shape remained the one thing that hadn't changed. A soft rebellion stitched in felt. You reach a small rise now and pause. Below you, the moonlight reveals a wide field of snow. Empty. Still. But for a moment, you see it just a flicker. A rider crossing the distance, hat tilted sideways, moving through the fog like a memory that refuses to melt. And maybe that's what the hat became in the end. Not a crown, not a relic, but a memory. One so distinct it could ride through time without losing its shape. You wrap your coat tighter and keep walking, snow crunching underfoot. Somewhere out there, one more hat waits, covered in frost, cut in silhouette, leading, always leading even long after the man beneath it is gone. The snow has faded behind you now, and the road winds downward through softer hills and warmer air. Your cloak rustles gently with each step, and the moon overhead has turned from silver to a warmer glow, like candlelight spilling across old parchment. You feel the shift, not just in temperature, but in tone. You're leaving the battlefield behind, and yet, the hat comes with you. Because even after the battles ended, even after the cannons cooled and the final treaties were signed, Napoleon's hat kept walking. Tonight, we arrive on the island of Elba. You hear the ocean before you see it. Gentle waves lap against the shore, and somewhere in the distance, gulls cry out like sentinels too lazy to enforce anything. This is exile, but it doesn't feel like defeat. At least not at first. Napoleon disembarked here in May of 1814 after his forced abdication and the collapse of his first empire. He was allowed to rule Elba as its sovereign, which is a little like letting a tiger redecorate a rabbit hutch. Naturally, he got to work reforming roads, setting up schools, inspecting farms, and yes, wearing the same hat, as if nothing had changed. Because that was the point. You walk the paths of Elba now, along citrus groves and rocky hills. You pass villagers nodding respectfully at a man on horseback short, composed, unmistakably imperial. His hat is still worn sideways, as if daring the world to say otherwise. There's a quiet dignity in that image. No throne, no battalions, just a black felt curve under the sun, cutting through exile like it's just another campaign. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's choice to keep wearing his imperial uniform and hat during exile was defiance, habit, or a stubborn refusal to be anything but himself. Some suggest it was a psychological tool, a way to maintain identity amid humiliation. Others think he was simply never one for change. He had, after all, worn the same coat and hat for decades. But whatever the reason, it worked. You sit now on a stone bench beneath a fig tree, the Mediterranean shimmering ahead of you. A young boy runs by, pretending to march, a paper hat perched sideways on his head. He calls out orders to imaginary troops, and you realize even here, even in this quiet place far from Europe's palaces and bloodied fields, the shape of that hat still carries power. It was here, in Elba, that the legend began to solidify. Not just Napoleon the man, but Napoleon the idea, the silhouette, the posture, the brim that never flinched, word spread of his daily rides, his energetic reforms, his refusal to vanish into obscurity. People whispered that he hadn't really lost, that the emperor was simply pausing. And the hat helped tell that story. When Napoleon escaped Elba in early 1815 and returned to France, he was not wearing a disguise. He didn't slink through shadows. He walked openly with the hat on full display. His old soldiers recognized it before they recognized his face, and when they did, they fell in line without hesitation. That's the power of a symbol. There's a moment often dramatized in films when Napoleon stands before a battalion sent to arrest him. He opens his coat, bares his chest, and says, "If any of you would shoot your emperor, do it now." But it's the hat they see first. It's the hat that reminds them who he is. And no one shoots. You walk the path those soldiers might have taken, winding gently up toward Grenoble, past crumbling farmhouses and old watch towers. The road is lined with wild flowers now. The war long gone. But the stories linger. One woman once claimed she saw the emperor pass by and recognized him by that flat crown he always wore. It had become part of the man, or perhaps the man had become part of it. The man. From that moment, the march to Paris became inevitable. Each day, more soldiers defected to his side. Each stop brought more cheers. The Bourbon King fled. Napoleon entered Paris once more, and the hat entered with him. But victory was short-lived. You pause at a stone crossroads where 3 signs point in different directions: Paris, Waterloo, and St. Helena. You already know which path you'll take, but first, take a moment to reflect. Even after Elba, after his return, after Waterloo, the hat never vanished. When Napoleon surrendered and was exiled again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena, he took several of his bicornes with him. They traveled thousands of miles by ship, tucked in trunks alongside books and maps and unfinished plans. On St. Helena, he wore them less. He was older, sicker, the winds were harsh, the climate difficult, but he still kept them close. On walks around the garden, during slow afternoons of dictation, the hat remained, even as the man faded. One story, a quiet one, tells of Napoleon placing one of his hats on a table beside a globe. He stared at it for a long time, then covered the hat with a cloth. No one asked why. You walk now under the arching branches of an old tree, the sea breeze brushing your cheeks. You don't see Napoleon, but the shape is there. Always just ahead, always sideways, always steady. The man would die, but the hat was just beginning. The road ahead becomes quieter now, not because no one's there, but because everything that once was has already happened. The cheering crowds, the cannon blasts, the surrender, the escape, the return. You walk along a path of aftermath, the kind of silence that follows a great storm. And the hat, it's still here, still present, but no longer atop Napoleon's head. Because now we enter the strange, lingering afterlife of an object that outlived its owner, an object that, in some ways, became more famous once the man was gone. You're standing at the edge of a museum room now, polished wood floors, velvet ropes, a glass case, dimly lit from above. Inside a black felt bicorne, slightly faded, stiff but elegant. Sitting atop a silk cushion like it belongs to royalty, which technically, it does. This is one of Napoleon's original hats, a real one. Or, at least, that's what the plaque says. And now the second life of the hat begins. After Napoleon's death in 1821, his belongings were catalogued, divided, gifted, hidden, or stolen. His hats, those silent, symbolic companions, became treasured relics. They passed from generals to museums, from family collections to auction blocks, from dusty trunks to shining display cases in cities across Europe. Some were kept in perfect condition, others were lost and rediscovered decades later, tucked into drawers or bundled in cloth like a secret too powerful to throw away. You wander through an imaginary hall of hats now, each in its own case, each with a small card worn at Marengo, recovered from Elba, donated by Marshal Bertrand. The rooms feel reverent, almost sacred. Visitors whisper without knowing why. One of the more famous hats resides in a museum in France. It's displayed under glass, with a small eagle emblem nearby and a slightly faded label that reads simply, Chapeau de l'Empereur. It has become less an object and more an altar. Historians still argue whether all the hats on display are authentic. Provenance is a tricky thing. Some records are incomplete. Some hats were made in imitation just after his death, purchased by admirers or opportunists, and others were forged outright. But more on that in a moment. You walk into another gallery now, this one less polished, the paint peels slightly, the floorboards creak, and in the center a glass dome with a very humble hat inside. It's stained, the lining is frayed, there's a tear near the brim, carefully repaired, but the small brass tag insists worn at Waterloo. Real who knows? What matters is that people come to see it. They don't come to read his speeches. They don't come to see his sword. They come for the hat. The curved shadow of power, preserved in fabric and felt. One of the most extraordinary episodes in the hat's second life happened in 2014 when one of Napoleon's original bicornes was sold at auction for nearly $2.2 million. The buyer, a wealthy South Korean businessman. The event made headlines around the world not because of the price, but because of what it proved 200 years later. Napoleon's hat could still fill a room. You step into a shadowy side chamber now, lined with red velvet curtains. In the center is a rotating display with 3 hats, all nearly identical. A placard reads, "One of these belonged to Napoleon, 2 are replicas. Can you tell the difference?" You squint, the brims are all crisp, the linings are silk, the angle's just right. You guess, but does it matter? The moment you recognize the silhouette, the rest is imagination. One scholar once described Napoleon's hats as vehicles of projected memory. That is, objects that allow us to remember something more clearly than the man himself. Because honestly, how many of his quotes can you recall? How many battles can you list? But the hat, you'd know it in silhouette. And that silhouette made its way far beyond museums. In 19th century plays and operas, actors portraying Napoleon always wore the hat. Never mind if it was historically accurate for the scene. If there's a Napoleon on stage, he better have the hat. Audiences wouldn't accept otherwise. One theater director reportedly had to fire a promising actor for trying to wear a plumed helmet instead. "You don't get to be artistic," he said. "You have to be Napoleon." You chuckle, because the hat really did become a kind of requirement, a shortcut to recognition. From satire to celebration, it crossed genres like it crossed borders. There's a particularly odd painting from the late 1800s that depicts Napoleon riding a white goose. Yes, a goose into battle, wearing the bicorne. The goose wears one too. It was political commentary, possibly also dinner party humor. But either way, the hat made it work. Because even when the scene is ridiculous, the hat anchors it. You know who it is. No label required. You walk now through a long, narrow hallway, its walls lined with shelves of paper soldiers, tin figurines, tiny portraits. Every single one of them, down to the smallest brushstroke, wears the same sideways hat. Some are solemn, some comical. One, carved from a walnut, looks suspiciously smug. That's the power of shape. It's what happens when an object slips out of history and becomes part of culture. You take a final step into the quietest room yet. No labels, no lights, just a single chair, and on it, resting gently like a whisper, is a felt hat sideways. Of course, no guards, no plaque, Just you and the silence that always follows a story too big to finish. And the hat, it doesn't need to speak. It said everything it needs to already. Word count 196. The door to the museum closes softly behind you, and the night greets you once more like a familiar companion, cool, a little amused, and full of stories still left to tell. You walk back into the open air, where the stars blink slowly overhead, and the grass whispers beneath your steps. You've seen the hat under glass, on stage in paintings, and in toy shops, but now it's time for something stranger, quieter, maybe, but definitely stranger. Because Napoleon's hat didn't just retire to museums and polite auctions. No, it entered the unpredictable, occasionally dusty, and always fascinating world of collectors. You step into an imagined drawing room, now dark mahogany walls, soft red carpet, the faint smell of pipe smoke and old books. Glass cabinets line the room, filled not with gemstones or rare coins, but hats, or what claim to be hats. At least a dozen bicornes, all meticulously tagged, possibly from Elba, likely worn during Italian campaign. Gifted to Baron X by Marshal Y. A few tags simply say, origins unknown, feel free to speculate. Welcome to the collector's domain. For nearly 2 centuries, the hats have passed from hand to hand, often at shocking prices, occasionally through backroom deals that involve more drama than a royal divorce. These hats became something more than memorabilia. They became proof of proximity. Owning one was like shaking hands with history, or at least tipping your hat to it. In the 19th century, aristocrats would display their supposed Napoleon hat alongside medals and miniatures, usually in a glass dome on a pedestal just low enough for guests to peer in, but never touch. One English lord reportedly made guests remove their own hats before entering the same room as his authentic Waterloo bicorne. He called it protocol. Others called it deeply weird. Historians still argue whether certain high-profile collectors were duped. The truth is, many were. For every hat with genuine provenance letters, receipts, witness accounts, there were 3 or 4 with fuzzy origins, found in an attic, traded from a French general's nephew's neighbor, gifted by a mysterious Corsican man during a rainstorm. The stories were always compelling, the stitching less so. One collector famously paid a small fortune for a hat that, under later inspection, was revealed to be a 19th century theater prop made with glue, not shellac, and lined with coarse linen better suited to sofa cushions. The buyer refused to admit the mistake, insisting, even if it isn't his, it feels like it could have been, which might be the most honest thing ever said about the whole business. You wander deeper into this imagined study, running your fingers across rows of dusty volumes titled Hats of the Empire and Millenary of Revolution. On a desk nearby, a magnifying glass lies atop a black felt brim. The collector who lives here is clearly someone who wants the hat to be real. Whether it is, that's secondary. And then there's the auctions. You arrive at a grand hall, now velvet-draped walls, a podium at the front, bidders seated in discreet rows of folding chair. At the center, a hat, carefully displayed, sideways, as it should be. The auctioneer raises his gavel and begins, The hat you see before you, he intones, was likely worn by the emperor between 1807 and 1809, possibly during the Wagram campaign, acquired by the family of General So-and-so and kept in pristine condition for over a century. Bidding starts at 300,000 pounds. You look around, no one flinches. One bidder scratches his nose, another raises a gloved hand. The numbers climb, 400,000, 500,000, 750,000. A woman in the back taps her card at $1 million as if buying lunch. A man in a scarf who hasn't blinked in 12 minutes raises it to $1.5 million. And then, silence. The gavel drops. Sold. Just like that. The hat vanishes backstage, soon to be boxed in velvet and flown across oceans to join a private collection in a place where it may never be seen again. It's an odd feeling, like watching a ghost change hands. You step out of the hall, down a long corridor of gilded frames and echoing footsteps. A man in a blue suit passes you, carrying what looks like a perfectly folded document folder. It could be a receipt. It could be a birth certificate for a very lucky hat. And just when you think it can't get more peculiar, you discover the hat impersonators. You walk now into a small room filled with replicas, not just lookalikes, but performers, hats worn by stage actors, film props, military reenactors who commissioned hand-stitched copies down to the exact French cockade angle. There's even a group, yes, a society devoted to preserving bicorne accuracy. Their meetings involve lengthy discussions about brim curvature, stitching density, and whether a particular dye reflects light too brightly under candle conditions. They are, in their own way, guardians of memory. Just very specific memory. One replica was made for a wax museum in the early 1900s and accidentally swapped with a genuine article during a refurbishing mishap. By the time curators noticed, no one could tell which hat was real. They picked one and put the other in storage. Both are still on display at different museums. Which one's real, you'll never know. And maybe that's the charm. Because ultimately, this isn't about authenticity. It's about the silhouette, the curve, the shape that travels through time, resting lightly on history's shoulders. You exit the imagined auction house, the night cool and still. You walk again under star, and for a moment, just for a heartbeat, you think you see someone ahead. Striding along the path, not too tall, wrapped in gray, and wearing that unmistakable black arc on his head. But when you blink, it's gone. Only the shape remains. You've followed the hat from battlefield to glass case, from exile to auction, but now you step into a different kind of stage, one lined not with cannon smoke or velvet curtains, but painted backdrops, papier-mâché sets, and a very well-lit hat. Because yes, the Emperor's headgear marched straight into the world of theater, and once it arrived, it never really left. You push open the creaking door of an old opera house. The scent hits you first, dust, varnish, velvet. The soft hush of heavy curtains absorbing echoes. You wander into the auditorium, empty for now. Its rows of red chairs lit faintly by the moonlight coming through high windows. The stage ahead is dark, except for a single spotlight. And there it is, a hat, placed with reverence on a low table. The hat doesn't move. It doesn't need to. Because once Napoleon's story entered popular imagination, so did the uniform. And once it hit the stage, that hat became a requirement. More than that, it became a visual shortcut, a kind of cultural emoji. The audience didn't need a name. They just needed that black, side-slung curve. In the 19th century, plays about Napoleon multiplied like overfed rabbits, tragedies, comedies, operettas, farces. Some focused on his military genius, others mocked his ambitions, and some just turned him into a lovesick protagonist who sighed too often. But in every version, the hat showed up early, usually in the first scene. Often before a single word was spoken. You find yourself behind the stage now, in a cramped dressing room filled with costume racks and scuffed mirrors. Feathers and tunics hang beside worn boots and grease paint sticks. On the counter sits a stack of bicorne stage versions, most of them made from stiffened fabric and painted to look like felt, but the shape unmistakable. Actors through the decades came to rely on that silhouette. Some used it to evoke command straight posture, arms behind back, chin tucked. Others played it for laughs, wearing the hat too large, or letting it droop comically over one eye. One production in Vienna reportedly opened with Napoleon emerging from a closet in full regalia, muttering, "Where's my sandwich?" The audience howled. The hat made it work. Historians still argue whether these portrayals shaped the modern perception of Napoleon or merely reflected it. Some suggest the endless stage appearances diluted the man into caricature. Others believe the repeated performance cemented the myth, shaping him into something more theatrical, more accessible, less a person, more a symbol. And the hat? The hat was the anchor. You drift into another imagined theater now, smaller, more intimate. The set is simple, a campaign tent, a writing desk, a flickering lantern. An actor steps forward, clad in gray, the bicorne perched perfectly. He says nothing for a moment, just stands in profile. The audience leans in. That's the magic of it. The hat announces the character before he moves, before he breathes. It carries the scene without asking permission. You remember hearing once about a production in Prague where the hat was the only costume piece retained through 3 versions of the script. "We changed everything else," the director said, "but we couldn't lose the hat. It was the only part the audience trusted." And it didn't stop at the theater. You walk now through a dreamlike exhibition of visual culture, rows of posters, lithographs, handbills. Napoleon, the hero of Europe. Napoleon the musical, Napoleon and Josephine, a love story with songs. Each image features the same thing. Not always the face, not always the uniform, but always the hat. Even in silent films, the shape did the talking. A 1909 short film called Napoleon's Dream opens with a shadowy figure asleep at a desk. He's in profile. He's motionless, but the hat is perched neatly on a coat stand beside him. That's all the audience needed. The dream began. There's something delightfully absurd about it, too. In one London pantomime, a character in a chicken costume wore a tiny Napoleon hat and addressed the audience in rhymed couplets about farmyard reform. It made no sense. It didn't need to. The moment you saw the hat, the joke landed. You pass a costume designer's table now, where bolts of fabric are piled beside sketches. Dozens of them, all with the same head shape. It doesn't matter who's playing the part, man, woman, cartoon, shadow puppet, the hat remains constant. One designer was once asked, what happens if the actor can't pull off Napoleon's intensity? "That's what the hat is for," she replied. And really, she wasn't wrong. Because long after the battles ended, after the flags fell, after the history books were closed, the theater kept the story alive, and not always accurately, not always kindly, but always recognizably. Because of that curve, that black, silent half moon above the brow. You walk now through the final curtain of the imagined stage. The audience is gone. The lights are dimmed, but there's one last hat resting center stage on a small stool. It's not new, not crisp, but it's angled just right. And in the quiet that follows applause, it holds the whole story together. You leave the stage behind, the scent of sawdust and powdered makeup lingering in your memory like a song you can't quite place. The night stretches ahead, quiet again. And the road feels smoother now, worn down by all the versions of Napoleon that have walked it. The general, the exile, the actor, the painting. And now, we enter a chapter less polished, less reverent, and a lot more suspicious. Because when something becomes iconic, people start making copies. You follow a narrow cobblestone path into a sleepy village, the kind with shutters that creak even when there's no wind. A sign hangs overhead, Le Musée des Chapeaux Perdus, the Museum of Lost Hats. It's fictional, sure, but only just. You step inside and find yourself surrounded by hats, rows upon rows of them. Some behind glass, some on mannequins, some casually stacked, as if someone ran out of shelves and gave up. And nearly every one of them claims to be the hat. Worn at Austerlitz, says one tag. Found in a stable outside Leipzig, says another. A third simply reads, genuine. You can't help but smile. Because this is where things get tricky. The legacy of Napoleon's hat became so powerful, so marketable, that it spawned an entire economy of imitation. Forgeries, replicas, mistaken identities, honest mislabeling. Some hats were made by milliners who just wanted to sell souvenirs. Others were crafted with the full intent of deception, sold to wealthy collectors and unsuspecting heirs who believed they were purchasing a piece of destiny. Historians still argue over how many surviving bicornes actually sat atop Napoleon's head. The number of claims is far higher than the number of documented originals. For every well-traced artifact in a state collection, there are 3 more in attics, auctions, or antique shops with very strong feelings but no paperwork. You pass a long wooden table where 2 scholars lean over a magnifying lens, examining the stitching of a particularly dramatic brim. One mutters, late 19th century. See the thread twist. The other counters, possibly restored from an earlier piece. The debate will last for hours. No one will win. It's a peculiar thing, this obsession with authenticity. You begin to realize it's not just about whether Napoleon wore the hat. It's about believing he might have. The possibility is almost as valuable as the proof. There's a tale of a small town in France where a bicorne was found in a chimney during renovation. The owners insisted it had been hidden during Napoleon's retreat, preserved by a loyal family servant. Experts inspected it, found inconsistencies, and dismissed it as a replica. The townspeople didn't care. They built a display for it in the local bakery. You walk through the back of the imagined museum now, where the lighting is low and the air smells of old felt. In the corner, a display case holds a hat with a very dramatic card, the last hat. Of course, it's not the last. There are dozens more beyond it, but it's part of the theater of authenticity. And sometimes, the forgeries tell stories just as compelling. One fake, discovered in the 1920s, had a hidden pocket sewn into the lining containing a small, folded note in Italian. It was a love letter, likely unrelated to Napoleon, but beautiful nonetheless. The hat wasn't real, but the romance was. Another replica, made in the 1890s for a stage production, was later given to a soldier heading to the front lines of World War I. He carried it in his pack, claiming it gave him courage. He survived. The hat was returned to his family and passed down as a talisman of the emperors. You reach a quiet room now, with only one exhibit, a single bicorne under warm yellow light, bicorne, mounted in the center of a round space. The sign beside it reads, unknown origin, possibly theatrical, definitely loved. You stand for a moment. That about sums it up. Because in the end, whether these hats are real, fake, borrowed, or misremembered, they all point back to the same thing, the power of a shape, the human desire to connect with something larger, even through a shadow on the brow. You exit the museum, stepping into the hush of early morning. The stars are still out, but the air smells faintly of dew and beginnings. And somewhere in a suitcase, on a shelf, in a collector's glass box, or maybe in the hands of a child wearing it sideways in the backyard, there's another Napoleon hat. Possibly real, possibly not. But still walking. You walk now under a gray dawn sky, where the wind carries the scent of damp stone and distant chimneys. The road is narrower, older, the trees lean over it like curious archivists, and your feet fall into that soft rhythm that only comes when history itself seems to slow down and breathe. You've wandered past generals, actors, forgers, collectors, but this next part, this is the part where the unexpected happens. Because in a twist that only history could invent, Napoleon's hat, this French icon, this stitched symbol of empire and ambition, was eventually adopted by England. Yes, you heard that right. You blink, glance upward, and for a moment think, surely not. But as the old stone lane guides you toward a small outpost surrounded by clipped hedges and precisely stacked mailbags, you begin to understand. Picture it: a British postal worker in the early 1800s, standing proudly in a dark blue uniform, topped with a sharply angled bicorne hat. That's right, the same shape, the same silhouette, the enemy's hat, repurposed. You step into the imagined sorting house, now rows of pigeonholes filled with carefully bundled letters. The smell of ink and seal wax still hanging in the air. Behind the desk, a postmaster smooths out a schedule while adjusting the brim of his unmistakably Napoleon-shaped headwear. How did this happen? Well, after Napoleon's fall, the British military, navy, and even civilian services began adopting elements of the bicorne not as homage, but as style. The Royal Navy had already flirted with the design in the late 1700s, but in the 19th century, it became standardized for dress uniforms. Senior officers in the British Army wore it on formal occasions. Even some government officials used it as a mark of authority. Historians still argue whether this was imitation, irony, or pure practicality. Some say it was meant to send a message: we defeated you, and now we wear your hat. Others think it was just because the silhouette looked commanding and paired nicely with epaulettes. A few believe the British couldn't resist co-opting something that had so effectively captured public imagination. And capture it they did. You stroll past a cluster of uniform mannequins now, each dressed in crisp British regalia, scarlet coats, silver buttons, and yes, the bicorne. One wears a military sash. Another cradles a ceremonial sword. A third holds a leather mail satchel. Each hat tilted just so. It's odd, isn't it, that something once so uniquely French, so fiercely Napoleonic, became a fixture on the heads of the very people who had fought to bring him down. But history's sense of humor is dry and patient. One anecdote tells of a British officer who wore his bicorne slightly sideways during a royal inspection. When asked why, he replied, "It keeps the sun out of both eyes, and the ghosts of Corsica off my shoulder." Practical and poetic. Even more curious was the Victorian era's embrace of the bicorne for postal service uniforms. Yes, actual mailmen, walking through foggy streets of London, wore bicornes as part of their dress uniforms on ceremonial occasions. Some even delivered royal mail in them. There's something delightfully absurd about the idea of a weary postman trudging through puddles with soggy envelopes, dressed like a Napoleonic general on his day off. But it speaks to something deeper. The hat had transcended its origin. It had become a visual language. Authority, tradition, uniformity. You pause now at a small stone bridge where a single blackbird hops along the parapet. Below, a plaque is mounted in the mossy wall. Here stood the last British military post to retire the bicorne hat, 1921. That late, the design lingered, Long after Napoleon's bones were buried, long after France had changed governments, styles, and flags more times than most people change curtains, the hat stayed. Even today, in certain British ceremonies, naval parades, no royal inspections, you'll still see it. Worn straight on, not sideways, trimmed in gold, impeccably pressed, but unmistakably descended from the shape made famous by a man whose ambitions spanned a continent. You walk a little farther and come across an old coat hook mounted on a stone wall. Hanging from it, a faded bicorne, slumped slightly to the left. Whether it was worn by a French marshal or a British postmaster, you can't say. It doesn't matter. Because by this point, the hat belongs to more than one country. It belongs to memory, to repetition, to the way an object becomes so familiar that we forget how strange it once was. You step off the path now into a small English village green. There's a parade happening, a local reenactment. Children with wooden muskets, costumed riders on ponies, and there, among the adults dressed as redcoats and revolutionaries, a young girl marches proudly at the front wearing a paper bicorne. It's lopsided, too big, probably taped together 15 minutes before the event. But still, you recognize it instantly. The shape endures. The village fades behind you now, and with it go the marching bands, the paper hats, and the warm applause of neighbors waving from hedgerows. The path grows quieter once more, folding inward like the final pages of a long, curling letter. But don't worry, we're not done yet, because there's one more transformation to trace. The bicorne has survived war, it has weathered exile, it has tiptoed through opera houses and waltzed across auction floors. But now, it slips into something stranger, something softer, sillier, sweeter. The hat becomes an icon of pop culture, long before anyone knew what that phrase meant. You arrive at a toy shop now, not a modern one, but something out of a faded storybook. A brass bell above the door, shelves groaning with wooden toys, painted tin soldiers, clockwork horses, and candy jars with lids too big for their contents. It smells like varnish and peppermint, and tucked between displays of building blocks and picture books is a glass case filled with Napoleon, or rather dozens of miniature versions of him. Tiny painted figurines, all in gray coats and black bicorns. Some are stern, some look grumpy. One is clearly whistling. The hat is always there, though perfectly rendered, even at the size of a walnut. You smile, because here, the hat has entered the realm of the adorable. Historians still argue whether Napoleon would have been horrified or flattered by this legacy. On the one hand, the man who once ruled Europe is now a character on a chocolate box. On the other, no one forgets him. How could they? His face is on everything from cookies to cartoons. You pick up a tin soldier from the display, a little scuffed, one eye missing but still proudly tilting its bicorne sideways as if giving a toy-sized speech to an army of gumdrops. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Napoleon became a favorite figure for illustrators and marketers. Needs someone to represent authority, ambition, or exaggerated seriousness. Draw Napoleon, or at least draw a man with a tiny chin, crossed arms, a wide coat, and that hat. It became shorthand for more than history. It became a mood. You leave the shop and find yourself outside a bakery now. In the window, a display of pastries shaped like famous figures Shakespeare, Cleopatra, Napoleon. His is filled with raspberry jam and topped with a candy hat. Sideways, of course. Napoleon is a pastry. The hat made it possible. Even political cartoons fell in love with the silhouette. In Victorian England, Napoleon was reimagined as a bombastic little general trying to conquer a teacup. In American newspapers, he was drawn atop ladders, on barrels, even being chased by angry chickens, all identifiable only by the angle of his hat. He became, somehow, universally mockable, and thus universally memorable. One comic strip in the 1920s featured a character named Little Boney, a short-tempered boy in a bicorne who tried to boss around cats. It ran for years. No one needed to explain who he was parodying. And it didn't stop there. You pass into a small cinema now, where flickering black and white images dance across the screen. A silent comedy plays a man trips over his own boots, spills soup on a map, and tries to declare war on a folding chair. He's wearing a bicorne. The audience howls. It's hard not to. The hat became visual comedy gold. One director once remarked, "Give any actor a bicorne and a frown, and they're already halfway to being Napoleon, even if they're 3 feet tall and wearing slippers." You walk behind the screen where the images keep playing silent, looping. Napoleon dances. Napoleon rides a unicycle. Napoleon sells biscuits. He is dignified and ridiculous, tragic and cartoonish. The hat is what allows all of that. It grants permission for the figure to be anyone and everything. There's even a story, possibly apocryphal, of a French chocolate company in the 1930s that printed a little comic of Napoleon and his magical hat inside candy wrappers. The premise, every time the hat landed on someone else's head, they became a genius. It was sweet, literally. And then there's the world of advertising. You walk past an old billboard now, cracked and fading in the early morning light. The image is simple, a determined-looking man in a gray coat, chin raised, bicorne tilted, holding a tin of shoe polish. The tagline, "Command your shine like Napoleon." You shake your head, amused. Somehow, it works. Because the hat, by this point, means more than Napoleon. It means ambition, or ego, or leadership, or tiny mischief. Whatever the context needs, it provides. You step into a small toy museum now, one of those places where everything smells faintly like attic and varnish. The exhibits are lovingly arranged tin drums, painted cannons, wooden horses, and there, under a bell jar, a figurine no bigger than a teacup. His coat is chipped, his boots are scuffed, but the hat, perfect, stiff, proud, and unmistakably sideways. A small plaque reads Napoleon toy, circa 1890, manufacturer unknown. Children still recognize who this is. Adults, too. You linger for a moment, then step back outside, the air now tinged with sunrise, and as you walk, you realize something simple, something strange and oddly comforting. The man may have gone, the empire may have crumbled, but the hat keeps finding new heads to perch on, even ones made of chocolate or tin. Because in the end, greatness leaves a shadow. And sometimes, that shadow looks a lot like a sideways brim. You walk now through an open field bathed in morning gold. The sky has softened from gray to pale blue, and the grass shimmers with dew as if the land itself has been gently polished overnight. Each step feels slower now, not from weariness, but from reverence. The journey is winding down, but the story of the hat is not finished. Not quite. Because before the hat becomes history, before it settles quietly into the corners of museums and memory, there's one final chapter it must complete. The chapter of smallness, of miniatures, of models, of tiny things bearing enormous legacy. You pass a wooden workbench outdoors beneath a tree. The wood is scored with knife marks and glue stains. On it, a half-carved soldier stands frozen mid-march. No taller than your thumb. Beside him, a row of similarly small figures, each in various stages of painting, a gray coat here, a dab of crimson there, and topping each one, a hat. You already know the shape. No, the tiny, perfect, sideways. You smile, because in the world of miniatures, Napoleon's hat has found a second empire, one ruled not by force, but by detail. Toy soldiers, tabletop battles, dioramas that recreate Waterloo down to the position of the sun and the angle of a saber. Collectors spend hours, no, days, sculpting the perfect curve of that brim. Not too tall, not too low, just enough tilt to say, this is the emperor, even if he's only half an inch tall. Historians still argue whether these miniature armies educate or glorify, but few can deny their artistry. There are entire conventions devoted to recreating Napoleonic campaigns on living room-sized battlefields, and in every one of them, the hat is center stage. You wander now through a small toy maker's cottage, shelves lined with hand-painted lead soldiers. There's a full French column arranged in a tight square, bayonets forward, flags raised by, and at the front, a lone figure on horseback, barely visible to the naked eye, but his hat, somehow, even at this scale, it stands out. It leads. It always leads. In Germany, in the early 20th century, one company produced a limited run of chocolate figures wrapped in foil to commemorate Napoleon's birthday. They sold quickly, partially because they were delicious, and partially because the foil wrapping showed a proud little figure in a gray coat and, you guessed it, a bicorne. One child saved the wrapping, pressed it into a book, and when she grew old, donated it to a museum. It remains there today, carefully flattened, still bearing the shadow of the hat. You step through a narrow gate into a quiet garden where hedges are clipped into military precision. On a stone table at the center, an elaborate chess set waits. The pieces are themed French versus British. Waterloo in miniature. The emperor is the king. Naturally, his hat forms the crown, and beside him saw the Queen Josephine, sculpted with care, wears a much daintier version of the same. It's all so small, and yet so full of meaning. You sit for a moment on a carved bench watching morning light dance across the chessboard. The horses look poised to gallop, the pawns wide-eyed, and that hat, it anchors the whole scene. There's something endearing about how a symbol of dominance, once feared and exalted, now finds itself shrunk for the sake of storytelling, of learning, of play. The same hat that commanded legions now perches on birthday cakes, mantelpieces, and collectible keychains. You rise and continue walking, your path lined with stalls, now market booths from another time. Vendors sell painted figurines, biscuit tins, even tea towels printed with Napoleon's silhouette. A child clutches a wind-up toy that spins in a circle and tips its tiny hat with a click. A man in spectacles explains, to no one in particular, how this replica is from the Toulon campaign. You can tell by the buttons. And through it all, the hat remains the anchor. Not because of what it does, but because of what it suggests. Ambition, command, memory, a little bit of pride, a little bit of theater, the sort of thing that, even in miniature, makes people pause and point. You walk now past a classroom window where children sit hunched over paper. Inside, their teacher holds up a drawing of Napoleon round face, stern eyes, arms crossed. The hat, slightly exaggerated. Laughter bubbles up, and not from mockery, but from recognition. Even at that age, they know what it means. You keep moving, the road fading into a sunlit haze, You pass a final stall, a woman painting matchstick figures. One wears a red plume, another carries a musket, and one barely taller than the brush used to make it wears the bicorne. You lean in. The paint isn't dry yet. It smells like something new. Because in every era, the hat finds a way to return, smaller, maybe, but no less potent. It shrinks to fit the shelves and minds of those who come after but never disappears. And maybe that's the truest kind of legacy. Not to remain big forever, but to be remembered, even when made small. The sun is high now, casting warm light across the path as your journey brings you to its quiet conclusion. The fields have opened wide again, the hedges fall away, and the horizon seems to pause just long enough for you to breathe. You're no longer walking towards something, you're walking with something. The weightless outline of a hat that's carried more than just fabric and thread. It's carried memory, myth, ambition, comedy, reverence. And it's time now to understand why. Why did Napoleon's hat become such a legend? Because in the end, it wasn't the stitching or the curve. It wasn't the silk lining or the leftward tilt. It was something simpler, something older than military dress codes and older than empire. It was the power of recognition. In an age without screens, symbols had to speak loudly. A man could be a general, an emperor, a ghost of revolution, all with one glance at a silhouette. And that hat, worn sideways like a sideways crown, said more in its silence than words ever could. You come now to a low stone wall overlooking a vast green plain. Wind rustles through the tall grass. A few birds wheel overhead. On the wall sits a single object, a hat, gently resting, just slightly off center. It might be real. It might be replica. It might be an echo from someone else's dream. But when you see it, you remember the stories, the ones you've walked through tonight. You remember the battlefield, fog curling around Napoleon's boots as the black brim cuts through smoke. You remember the dinner table at Tuileries, courtiers falling silent as the hat enters before the man. You remember Elba and how even in exile, the emperor placed his hat like punctuation at the start of each day. You remember the glass cases, the auction paddles, the costume drawers, the fake ones, the cherished ones, the ones that made people weep even though they were made of stiffened wool and little else. And most of all, you remember how that hat somehow walked from 1804 to today without ever needing to raise its voice. Historians still argue about the man beneath it, about his politics, his legacy, his ego, his intent. But no one debates the hat, because the hat became everyone's. It belongs to military reenactors who spend weeks perfecting the curve of its brim, to opera singers who raise it in triumph or toss it in heartbreak night after night, to children who draw it with 2 crayon strokes and call it Napoleon, to scholars, to collectors, to jesters, to dreamers. It is serious and silly, regal and ridiculous, small and enormous. It is a shadow shaped like ambition. It is a crown that fit no throne. It is the most famous hat in history. And you've walked every step of that journey. You've felt the weight of its meaning and the surprising lightness of its afterlife. And now, with the morning breeze against your face and your eyes soft with sleep, you take one last look and let it go. Let everything settle now. Let your shoulders soften, your jaw unclench. Let the edges of history dissolve gently, like dust in warm water. The cannon fire is long gone. The velvet curtains are drawn. The crowds have drifted home. And the hat rests, quiet, folded into the gentle curve of time. You can almost hear the silk whispering beneath your fingertips, the way the brim would tip ever so slightly in the wind. You don't need to chase it anymore. You've followed it far enough through snowy battlefields, silent museums, soft-lit theaters, and toy makers' shelves. Let your breath slow, let your eyes grow heavy, and know that somewhere, even now, a small child is sketching a triangle with a curl and calling it a legend. A curator is adjusting a glass case. A reenactor is straightening his costume. Someone is holding a postage stamp between tweezers and smiling because, yes, even here, the hat remains. Symbols don't need to shout. They just need to stay. And this one has stayed long enough to lull you into a stillness deeper than history, a calm older than empires, a sleep as certain as memory. So rest now. Let the road grow soft beneath you. Let the wind cradle your thoughts like parchment, And if you dream, let it be of quiet footsteps and a black felt curve in the morning light.